Okay. All pictures have been taken with consent. All characters are non-fiction. Okay. So yes, before I dive into like the mechanics of this study, I'll just give like a personal rationale as to why this topic has been my personal project for many years now. So I've always been, and of course, in a country like Pakistan, where our context and especially the context of school really drive as to how you look at the world and how you formulate and define that worldview. I've always been, and my world was also informed very strongly by whatever I read at school, whatever I studied, and whatever our teachers taught us in different ways as well. That has been a very strong standpoint. But then growing up, I think the biggest challenge was to unlearn those things. And in process of doing so, long story short, I ended up working in education, and now I've always been very interested as to how the way we look at the world goes back to what's been taught to us in classrooms and through our textbooks and by our teachers. So this study basically attempts to encapsulate all of that in just 50,000 words. Okay, so that's the aspect of the worldview. In the context of Pakistan, there's always been a very strong reinforcement of religion as well as nationalism, which is why it's very difficult to see a perspective otherwise, especially if you look at primary school students. My study particularly looks at the textbooks, but there have been particular gaps in research because there have been many studies conducted that evaluate the impact of curriculum within classrooms and on children, but there hasn't been a channel that takes it back to a policy level. And that's what I attempt and very humbly try to do in this study. So I think one biggest standpoint and significance of this study is that it traces these mutations of curriculum at 3 different levels upon which I've premised my entire methodology. So before I go ahead, here are my research questions. Number 1, how is the national curriculum framed by the state to promote ideals of political socialization in Pakistan? Number 2, how is that curriculum delivered in classrooms to promote those ideals? And number 3, how is the national curriculum received and appropriated by children that influences their political socialization? And I would say that the last level of my study has been the most challenging one because it's so broad and there's so much to look at here. In terms of my methodology, I adopted this curriculum typology by these brilliant guys, Travis, Westbury, and Ake. And what they do is that they basically compartmentalize the curriculum and its transformation along 3 levels from the state to a classroom level. So the first level is intended curriculum, which simply means that all the policymakers or the state machinery that is involved into formulating a curriculum, what rationales do they incorporate when they make a curriculum policy, and consciously or subconsciously, what agendas are projected at that very level. At a second level is the delivered curriculum level. This is where we look at how the teachers deliver that very curriculum, but at the same time, it's not exactly what the state tells them or what the textbook tells them, but it's also whether human beings are not robots, which we are afraid might take over soon, I hope not. But the idea is that how is it that they use their own knowledge and their own appropriation and understanding of that curriculum so as to then teach children. The third one is the received curriculum. So now you have kids who have textbooks in front of them, teachers teaching them, and a state with this overarching policy or an agenda as to what kind of ideas they're supposed to learn and how is it appropriated by them, and that how that informs the way they look at the world. So this has been a transition that I'm trying to look, because I strongly believe that curriculum does not operate in isolation and has to do with all these mechanisms that are involved in the study. Very quickly, I did a methodological triangulation, which simply put is that on 3 different levels, I adopted 3 different research methods. So for a policy level, I analyzed a policy document of social studies curriculum. That my case of study was a primary school in Lahore. Because of limitations, I could not go to more schools, and obviously limitations of time. The grade was grade 5th, primary school, and yes, policy document. To understand the delivered curriculum, I observed 3 classroom sessions, and then following every classroom session, I conducted a focus group. So that's 6 observations, 6 focus groups, and 1 policy document. And then in my analysis, I triangulate them together, which gave me a lot of data. Quickly to go over how I intended to analyze my data. So I basically took 3 curriculum stands, namely citizenship, culture, and state and government within the social studies curriculum so as to encompass the projection of curriculum in all three levels. And I did a thematic analysis by Brown and Clark. You guys really helped me out. So yes, like I said, there are three different levels, three different research methods. So there was a lot of data that I was swimming through in the past whole year. So of course I can't present everything right now. Can't go over the data analysis of the policy or even the classrooms, but there has been a lot of interesting information that I gathered during my focus group discussions, and I'll just present you 1% of it. So for example, there was this one, I did different activities as well. So for example, I did these ranking exercises where kids were basically made to rank what kind of governments would they prefer in Pakistan. And not surprisingly, most of them ranked a military dictatorship over democracy, followed by different rationales that they expressed their views with. So for example, in grade 5, a social studies teacher once said that if we have to sacrifice our lives for the country, we must. So this is like a teacher teaching 9 to 11 years olds in a classroom, and this is one of the many thousands of public schools within Pakistan. Of course, the study is limited. I wasn't able to go to 20,000 schools in the country, but yeah, it's a representation of what mostly happens in most of them. One kid said the military helps, this is a grade 5 student, the military helps us and protects us from danger and India. Not very surprising as well. Probably we lost a match to them in cricket or whatsoever. But yes, like that's an idea that most of the kids, that's how they view what danger could be to the country. Another quote said, and this is where kids were asked, what are the aspects of your country that you like or don't like or associate or do not associate with? One of the girls said, people here murder each other in the name of religion, and I wish that did not happen so that peace prevails in our country. Another activity that I did, some of the other drawing activities that I did was that I made, for example, in this one, I made children customize the national flag of Pakistan. Now, I'm so sorry I did not present our national flag, but it looks somewhat like this. There's a white part and a majority of green part that presents Muslims, and the small white part presents the non-Muslim minorities in Pakistan. What I asked the children was that if you had to think of symbols that represent our country and put them on a flag, how would you represent your own flag? One child put a cricket bat in a ball and we love cricket. But the interesting part was that his entire flag was green. And when I asked him why that was the case, he said, my flag is entirely green because I feel that only Muslims should live in Pakistan. Non-Muslims here should also convert to Islam. And that's also what most other students agreed with within that focus group. This one would not look like one, but it's a military tank. I was also confused because it looks like a balloon. But this kid said that I want to join the Pakistani army and drive the military tank because more people will join the army if there's a tank on our national flag. Another 9 to 11-year-old kid. Just to put all of this together, I generated themes and coded them and put them into 5 broad themes. In my analysis, so I had a transition of a national to international nexus where I was trying to trace what values from a straight to a classroom level are national and international, like trying to categorize them. I looked at knowledge versus attitude. So for example, while this new curriculum claims to teach us certain values of egalitarianism and equality, what are the values that are only constricted to a knowledge aspect and the ones that transcend to actual attitudes by children, which were very less, but again, read my thesis for that. Nationalism, religion, a very, very strong aspect and themes that were very recurring in my study throughout. And lastly was the survival narrative that most of the students are internalized this idea that socially we are at some point of danger, which is why we need some kind of protection at a state level. General implications, this study overall maps the curriculum policy implications and creates a channel from a state to a classroom level, which can be applied to other studies. It deconstructs political socialization on different levels, especially with minor kids, it's difficult to do so. And well, this study attempts to like get into that and see how is it that we can then approach these problems. Teaching and learning dimensions, of course, textbooks, classrooms, and curriculum is not only at fault. So what are the other factors that are at play? How can teaching and learning dimensions and be made better? What pedagogical support can be provided? And how is it that we can basically dive into curriculum policies and see where are agendas involved and where is it that actual learning is happening? So yes, I think I'm almost 10 minutes. Thank you. Feedback question. I was on time. Okay. Questions, feedback, anything? Nothing? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
How was it for you personally to go through this process, knowing that you went through this system as well?
I guess can I have another 10 minutes? No. I mean, yes, since I described it was a project that was very close to me, and it was also challenging because there are things that you feel emotionally close to and things that you want to work on, but then to operationalize them in terms of research is one other challenge that I think most of us went through. Almost, I think pretty sure all of us went through. But I also think that this project was also tricky to do so because these are things that, like I said, the unlearning that happens in terms of things that you identify with and then you suddenly don't, and then trying to trace those and then locating them back at the school level made me reminded me of stuff like, okay, so I studied this in grade 5, but that was a lie, and then this is what I've been learning throughout my, I don't know, 13 years of education, and that didn't work out well. And well, I'm broadcasted online, but well, I learned that we may have won certain wars against a certain country, and turns out that we didn't. Or let's say that our religious studies curriculum was denominated by only one sect of Islam and completely marginalized other religious minorities. So what I'm trying to say is that yes, these are things that are very close to you, and it's just hard uh, to disengage, but also it was important to disengage to work as a researcher. Like I can talk about it and even give speeches passionately, but being a researcher and being unbiased was very difficult. So yeah, that's been one. Anything else?
I have questions online.
I'll just go to chat. Okay. I think that's it.
Yes, that's it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, Aziz. You can start.
Okay. Do I share my screen or how do I take control over the slides?
How we can hear him? Because
All right. So is it okay if I do the sharing myself? Am I visible, audible? Are the slides all right? Okay. Can't hear from anyone. I guess it's on the screen. So hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I couldn't join the Barcelona clan. And
Aziz, wait a second. We cannot hear you here in the room.
can't hear me? Am I audible? No?
Sorry.
Hi. Can you guys hear me? No? Okay, thanks so much. So here I am with my dissertation presentation. So my topic is, the title of my thesis is Embeddedness of Employability in Tertiary Education of Bangladesh, Exploring Policy and Praxis. This quite sounds like a flashy title. I've taken this multiple times, but I'd like to jump into the core part of presentation after I present some oversimplified stories you can tell. So here goes. So this is a story about Ali. Ali studies in a top class Bangladeshi university, and his parents, his government, and himself has spent a lot of money behind his education. And now Ali is graduate, and he has a lot of expectations to get something in return, basically employment, social mobility. So this is sort of his dream, his objective right now. So after graduation, Ali directly goes to the employment market. So this is Ali's employer. He applies for a job, but he doesn't know what's waiting out there, because his employer says that he is not equipped with the right knowledge, skills, and attributes to be employed. So basically, Ali is sad and he's heartbroken. So at this point, there are like sort of hundreds and thousands of Alis in Bangladesh. And when, like, this is a very oversimplified description of a very complex context. So analyzing this, the big question that comes in my mind is, can universities contribute to reducing the increasing rate of unemployed graduates? If yes, how? So to understand the how, we need to go a bit deeper into the context. So Bangladesh is a very young country. It's just enjoying its 50 years of independence. It's a very fast growing economy. Right now, it's going through its demographic dividend stage, which means there are more young people than children and elderly adults. So within this population, 4.2% are unemployed. It's a statistics by the Bureau of Statistics of Bangladesh from 2017, and it's still rising. There are other sources. I don't want to complicate the slides with the debates, but now like about 80% of this total unemployed population are youth, which is people aged between 18 to 35. So within this 80%, half of this 80% people are they belong to the not in education, employment, or training group. So they are basically graduates. They are basically university or college graduates, and they don't have jobs. So why don't they have a job? Like, this question's responsibility falls hugely on the shoulders of higher education institutions. So if we want to look into the context of higher education, the higher education institutions, we see that the institutions are heavily adapting neoliberal policies, which are mostly borrowed. Like there are so many literature behind this. The government and the parents invest a lot with an expectation of economic return, and this is kind of a broken promise for the country, that the higher the level of education you get, the better outcome you get in return. The higher education institutions have doubled just in 10 years in terms of number of institutions and enrollment rate, which resulted into a huge graduate inflation. You remember the 80% people from the previous slide. So this is one section of the context, and the other one, the other side of the fence, explains that the employers find severe lack in knowledge, skills, and attitudes and attributes of this graduates. So there can be debates, which is in my dissertation paper. I can share if anyone wants to read them, but I am going further into the context setting. So these higher education institutions majorly follow these three policies. So the one is the big strategic plan for higher education, which is supposed to run till 2030. There's this national youth policy, and there's this national qualification framework. So all these policies and strategies and frameworks, they majorly say that they are expansion focused. So quality is sort of ignored, and it seems like the policymakers are more interested in increasing the number of graduates rather than taking care of them or deciding where to place these graduates after all these investments. And employable skills development is kind of prioritized in all these documents, but there are like quite a few number of action points how to undertake these employable skills development programs. So this is the context. So
Asif,
yes.
Before you go further, you have 4 minutes left. I don't think you saw the chat.
Sorry?
You have 4 minutes left.
All right, okay. So I tried to explore the university's role in this whole complex situations. We can talk about this sometimes later, and this is recorded already. So basically, the key policies drive into the higher education institutions, and here are the graduates in gray. And I've tried to create a whole roadmap directed by Harvey, McQuaid, and Schneider and Ingram to understand how employment happens and where the higher education institutions can contribute in producing more employable graduates and how to elevate them in the employment market. And after understanding this, we followed Stephen Ball's framework of enacting education policies. So basically, any intended policy is supposed to have some outcomes in reality. And in between, there are two steps: how the actors or the practitioners interpret the policy and how they implement that. So this framework helps me create these two research questions, to help me formulate these two research questions, like how differently do practitioners interpret the employability policy goals, and how varied are the practitioners' reactions while enacting policy involving employability. So this is basically a qualitative research. I collected empirical data to understand the whys and the hows of the context, and I selected one of the oldest elite meritocratic university because of its strong connection to employment, and also because of its oldest history of operation in the field, which can give me a better idea of what also can be the worst scenario. So I interviewed 16 high-level academics who are basically deans, professors, directors, departmental heads. And the interviews were taken online. And why this high-level academics? Because they belong to the sweet spot where they, in both ways, connect with the policy level and the, and the future graduates. So I don't want to go deeper into the methodology. I used interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is a pretty straightforward process. And then I analyzed my data with NVivo 12, and full anonymity was ensured. So the key findings were the policy goals were really unclear, and the action points were very unclear. And the teachers found their accountability, the policy actors and practitioners found their level of accountability pretty undefined. And while assessing their enactment gaps, I found that there are inequality among disciplines, and the competitive advantages of the disciplines were ignored. So when they prepare the curriculum, the competitive advantage, they don't take this in account. And career counseling and internship programs are not very widely practiced. And if practiced, they are sort of positioned in an ineffective area. So the issues that are debated in the paper are transparency of policy intentions, and the definitions of the actors' accountability due to their indefinite workload within the academia. And I talked about inequality. The other thing that I debated in the paper is culture of militarism, where the faculty members have been discussing about academic freedom over this imposed policy implementation process, and which resulted into questioning the institutional autonomy and the historic institutional values. Are they affected or not? So there are quite some interesting policy implications that we wanted to.
Asif, sorry, it's me again. Can you conclude?
Yes, basically I'm at this end, so I'm ready to take questions, comments, remarks, thoughts, suggestions. No questions, thoughts, comments, suggestions? All right, so this is it then. I'm stopping the screen share, and let's continue with the next.
Thank you for your.
Thank you.
We will continue now with Umaima. Camera. Leave it like this because I'm on the right. As you wish. Hi, y'all. I think.
Hi.
Yes. Yeah, my sister's timing me. Don't worry. It's fun. No, I did my presentation.
You want to display it now? Yeah, the presentation, yes. Please. No, no, ¿es esta? Sí. Sorry, aquí.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. As strict as I am with all of you, I'll restrict myself as well with timing. My sister's timing me. Hi.
Yes, pero for some reason, yeah, I think. But wait. Wait, let me check some. I can do this one. And suppose I touch it.
Okay, now I can start. Welcome everybody. My name is Umayma Al-Hobzouri, and in the Netherlands we have a very big, I'm gonna do it old school. We have a very big crisis. Orange. We have a very big teacher shortage crisis, unfortunately. It's already more than a decade. And unfortunately, it's spread all over the country. And if you zoom more into it, you see there's an unequal distribution. So in the 4 biggest cities of the Netherlands, the shortage is the biggest. If you zoom even more into it, we see that with schools with a lower socioeconomic status, the shortage is even higher. And when I read that, I thought, okay, this is something that I want to understand. How come and why is that? So researchers have said it's because of salary that are not increased. It's because teacher training is maybe not attractive anymore. Or is it because that apparently after 5 years, teachers structurally leave? So they teach 5 years and they leave and never return to the job. So all these factors led to me to ask a specific question. Because I also have seen that the ministry has tried to apply multiple policies, but nothing has worked. It's already priced for more than 10 years, and the numbers are increasing, unfortunately. So that's why I asked a very basic question of why do teachers decide to leave a primary school in the Netherlands? And because there is an unequal distribution with schools with a lower socioeconomic background, I want to understand how do school contextual factors, apparently the socioeconomic status, have an impact on this decision? Does it have an impact? And also, do accountability mechanisms have an impact on this decision? I will go into that more later. Quickly, before I jump into conclusions, there is a conceptual framework, of course, that I use. So there are 3 concepts that came out of my literature review and out of my research in the Dutch context. And those are 3 concepts that I use to interpret my data. The first one is teacher autonomy. Teacher autonomy, well, I think we understand what that is. Teacher having the freedom to teach how they want. Let's just keep it like that. The school contextual factors that I just mentioned, socioeconomic status, the socioeconomic status of the school, the children, the parents, but also school resources. And then the third concept, accountability mechanisms. So again, these concepts came out of my research, meaning that they apparently were important to interpret data. So I use this, okay? Now we jump into conclusions. The results. So why do teachers leave? As Nim already said, with having done 22 in-depth interviews with teachers who have left a school and maybe are still teaching, but have left or do not teach at all anymore, I've had a lot of data. So I categorized everything into 5 main reasons, okay? I'm gonna mention them quickly and then I'm gonna elaborate a little bit into it. So the 5 reasons why they left is ineffective leadership, meaning the management team. Autonomy, surprisingly, was a topic. The workload, professional development, and as last the working condition. I was a bit shocked with the because these are also in hierarchical order, meaning that ineffective leadership was mentioned by all my participants. So the 22 teachers have mentioned this as their main reason and direct influence to leave their job. What does this mean? This meant for them in various ways that the school administration had a negative influence on their teaching experience, and that was different. That could have been pressure, feeling pressure, having very high expectations, them not being met, and then having a negative consequence of that. But also very extreme teachers that I interviewed were being psychologically harassed and also discriminated. So there are very heavy cases, and I'm most surprised by this result because this did not come. I did not see this in my literature review, and also not when I researched about the Dutch context. I'll say that there was no policy that I've read that it talked about ineffective leadership. Then the second one, autonomy. So you had a group of teachers that experienced too little autonomy, meaning not having the freedom to teach how they want. There were a lot of guidelines. They wanted to take maybe more time to teach something, give more one-on-one to the children, and that was not allowed very strictly. And then you had another group of teachers who maybe experienced too little autonomy in their, too much autonomy, meaning that the conclusion was that they needed more guidance and they didn't have that. They used the words, they had too much autonomy, which in their experience was not how they had like a good teaching experience. 5 minutes, thank you, Sweden. Then the workload, the third one, and that is I think one that we all have heard and that we all know generally from teachers, also internationally. So teachers in general, the task is hard. And then coming on to that they had that 15 teachers out of my 22 teachers that I've interviewed experienced a burnout before, after, or during teaching. And they mostly it was because of the heavy task of teaching in general, but also having to do other extracurricular activities besides their task of teaching, and they experienced enormous workload. So that was the third reason. Then the fourth reason, which I was surprised as well, was professional development. Again, I haven't read this a lot in history review, but it's the teachers needing a new challenge. Because there were new teachers coming into the job, and I have quotes in which teachers say that they already saw themselves doing this job for 60 years, but they do not see new positions which they can take. Also, some were offended that they couldn't think with the management team with new policies for their own school and to think with them how they could do things. They felt left out. So professional development was the fourth reason why teachers started left. And then the last one, working conditions. And this working conditions meant mostly salary, having a low salary, or the school not giving a new contract. And this was also surprising because in literature review, this is one of the most mentioned reasons, not having a high enough salaries. Whereas of my 22 participants, only one mentioned not having a high enough salary. Then the more, let's say, more deeper interesting analysis of the school context factors. So now we know the reasons why they left the school, but did the school contextual factors have a direct impact on their decision to leave and the accountability mechanisms? So some interesting thoughts about that. How I'm going on time? Okay. Some interesting thoughts about that is, yes, there was a significant impact, of course, of the school contextual factors on their decision to leave the school. I mean, we just talked about the hostile environment that they were experiencing, and knowing that the school working environment is a school contextual factor, meaning that their decision to leave was, yes, directly impacted by the school contextual factor. Also, a very interesting one is that low resource schools had more to deal with a higher teacher shortage, and that meant, for example, a case that I had a teacher that had to teach 16 children in primary school in one class. So that, of course, made the teacher fall into this vicious cycle of then not wanting to teach anymore in this class, so then leaving the school. And maybe a last one that I found the most interesting is that you do see that also the impact of how the lower the social economic position of the school, the higher the rate of teacher leaving, and that that is because in my research, I found many patterns of all these reasons that I mentioned were more present, and more of them, like cumulative, how do you say it? I don't know, counted up together. They were more present in these lower socioeconomic schools, so making teachers leaving earlier. And then the last one, accountability mechanisms, surprisingly again, did of course have an impact on their decision to leave, meaning bureaucracy, meaning results, the pressure to the administrative job. However, not as much as the school contextual factors, whereas in literature, this was mentioned as one of the biggest reasons why teachers leave in the Netherlands. And in my results, I found the school contextual factors being the biggest. I'm good. 1 minute? Okay, one closing thing is that as an implication, you see that in the Netherlands, the government has focused a lot on policies to make sure that teachers do apply, that we get more teachers to teach, because again, shortage. However, they did not focus enough on preventing the teachers leave. So with this result, it shows me that the government should focus more on keeping teachers there, apparently, because management and the principal have a direct impact on them leaving. Oh, sorry. I think this time. Yes.
You also ask the students, maybe say why teachers leave?
No, unfortunately not, because I didn't have, well, the time and everything, so it was only based on teachers.
Will you put the research anywhere? Like now you have interesting results, will you write that up in the paper?
Yeah, actually, I'm working now on it to publish the paper. Yes. Renata?
Yeah, I wanted to ask more about the practice and about the more from the aging, aging and or their retention of the teachers, or also considering for particular subjects, we also choose only primary schooling under why you chose primary and not secondary, and is it because of like certain subjects, or is it like in general? You have strategies for all the subjects.
Yes, those are multiple questions. I'm gonna try to answer them quickly, so I can get no. Thank you. Okay, why I choose for primary school? Because in primary schooling the problem is the biggest. However, the problem is also very big in high school, and there you see indeed that the problem is because in in science courses, I would say. So yes, there is a link between specific courses having less teachers. The second question, then where does it come from? So it's a combination. It's a combination of geographical, apparently the social economic factors that do have an impact. I think, from my research and from my humble opinion, that it's the resources of schools and in general, the resources that the government decides to put into the schools, not even the salaries. I mean, in general, those of course can get a raise and they need that. However, that's not the reason why teachers leave. It's mostly for example, I've had classes, and especially those, I couldn't say that because of time, but the schools with lower socioeconomic status, they have classes with children with special needs. Almost all of them had a class, half of them with children with special needs. Not having an assistant, being a beginning teacher. So they just started, or some of them still being in education. So can you imagine being like a beginning teacher, having half of the class with children with special needs, having a teacher shortage, sometimes having 60 children in the class. So I think it's I think it starts with the money and the resource that the school has, and that leads to all these other consequences, which accelerate the issue of the shortage. No, there is, because of the status of the job, because the salary, because of this professional development, they don't feel that there is an opportunity to grow. So it's not attractive anymore. And they try to change it.
Do you know what the teachers that leave school, like what do they do after they leave the school?
Interestingly, because they love education, they stay in education, but they have other positions, being a principal, being a pedagogical like assistant, like in a higher position at the school as well. Or very few of them, I think only one still in education, but went to higher education. So like a different age of students, yes, which like higher payment, more stable, and most of them said less workload comparison to primary school. Some maybe if you go ahead. Good questions, because I did my sample group was from up to 5 years, so and most of them they teach in the pandemic. So I did ask the question just in case, like at the end, that this had to do with the pandemic, but because most of them also were teaching before the pandemic and well, I mean, we're still in it, but at the end of the pandemic where physical teaching was possible again, I could see that the pandemic didn't have as much influence on these decisions that they, or on these reasons why they left, because the most mentioned reason, what was it? The ineffective leadership was there, even with the pandemic, without pandemic. So, thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you, Omaima, for sharing. Thanks, Omaima, for your presentation. And we will have now Ana Raquel Fuentes in a minute. Okay. ¿Dónde estás? Wait. ¿Quieres compartir ya, no? Sí. Bueno, I don't know why it's not like bigger there. Bueno, porque acá está así. Yeah, thank you, Marina. Hi, everyone. My name is Ana Raquel Fuentes, and I'm from Panama, and I did my thesis research on sexuality education, exactly in Panama, and how it is a battleground for ideologies. And I know this is a very foreboding word to use, but when you talk about sex or anything related to sex ed in Panama, it becomes a fight among groups who either support it or not. So for this, I analyzed the influence of the narratives on sexuality education and how these narratives influence public opinion. So to give you a super brief, let me see if this works. Background information. So Panama has had multiple attempts to have sexuality education, either as comprehensive sex education or abstinence-based education. It's usually abstinence-based or no sexuality education whatsoever. And what made me want to research this is because Panama is one of the highest countries in Latin America with teenage pregnancies and also a high rate of STIs and STDs. And there is also a lot of issues related to gender inequality that can be tackled with other teachings. So you kind of know my positionality now. And there has been multiple attempts to, like, as I said, like in 2014, congressman proposed a bill on sexuality and reproductive health in Panama that was mostly towards comprehensive sex education. And in 2016, created a massive debate. It's when the battleground basically started. And as you can see in the pictures that were retrieved from newspapers, there is people saying no to this bill because they thought it had gender ideologies that could corrupt people, whereas other people were like, danger, grandmas at 23 years old, because we have a huge issue of teenage pregnancies. And then the Ministry of Education, Meduca, in 2019, prepared 5 didactic guides based on sexuality and affectivity. And then in 2021, a congressman proposed another bill that at the end, this one didn't go through. And by the time my research was being done, one of the laws was approved, so I didn't include it in analysis. And it was the law 302, which basically the adoption of the 5 didactic guides. So knowing kind of this context, my research questions are, what are the narratives around the most recent attempts to implement sex education policies in Panama, and how do they influence the public opinion? And I follow it with these sub-research questions, which are, what are the beliefs of actors regarding sexuality education, and how do these narratives differ? So to know this debate, I wanted to know, so where does the debate and the rift start? So my methodological strategy had 2 lenses. So understanding how sex education is perceived by the actors and the public, and how the narrative of the actors are used to enact the policy and influence the public. And to analyze this, I use 2 categories. So comprehensive-based narratives and abstinence-based narratives. So as it says, so those who are more towards no sex education whatsoever, or just teaching abstinence, went to the abstinence-based narrative. And the comprehensive-based narrative were those that are like more towards CSE, sorry. My theoretical approach was twofold. I used symbolic interactionism and the narrative policy framework to analyze the narratives. And I used a mixed methods methodology, which included a survey, exploratory interviews, and document analysis. So the document analysis and the exploratory interviews was to see the actors themselves and the didactic guidelines. And a survey comprised an experiment with students, so they were the public, to see how these narratives influence what they think about sexuality education, mainly comprehensive sex education. So very briefly, the actors are the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, the Catholic Church, the Evangelical Church, because even though Panama is supposed to be a secular country, the church has power. And also the UN agency of the UNFPA, the UNESCO, and other NGOs and CSOs, as the Association of Family Planning, feminist groups, but also groups like the Panamanian Alliance for Family and Life. So even among the NGOs and CSOs, there is like a differentiation of who is where. So I did 8 interviews. So and it was to analyze and understand the view of those participating in the policy narrative process. By the way, these are not the real names; these are pseudonyms. And some of them are people who are on the comprehensive-based side, so they promote and advocate for comprehensive sexuality education. And then there is the people who are towards abstinence, and these are mainly people from church and also the Ministry of Education of Panama. And so for the interviews, I managed to interview 5 people for the comprehensive-based actors, and only 3 for the abstinence-based actors, because it was very hard to get a hold of them. They will say, yes, let's do the interview to talk about how we need to maintain the spirituality and the moral and blah, 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 but then they ignore me. So it was very hard to get them, but at least I got 3 of them. But from the comprehensive-based actors, from the interviews, I noticed that they advocate for the inclusion of everyone. They advocate that Panama really needs an evidence-based comprehensive sexuality education curriculum, because teenage pregnancies are going on the rise, gender inequality is insane, and there is a lot of human rights and sexual reproductive rights in Panama that could be solved, according to them, with comprehensive sexuality education. So that's why they also said that it is important to have comprehensive sexuality education so the Panamanian government can ensure the sexual reproductive right of every person living in Panama. And they need to promote humane programs that include the historically marginalized groups in Panama. And they recognize that the church is an actor, that it is present in Panama, but the church should not take part in the formulation and regulation of policies in education. And they recognize that parents or guardians must be involved in the development of their children and what the kids are learning, but they need to respect the individuality of the children and youth. So this is kind of like the core beliefs and narrative of those who advocate for comprehensive-based like sexuality education. And then in the abstinence-based, we see that it is important to maintain high levels of Christian morals and values, and it is important to safekeep Panamanian culture. And when they talk about it, is they believe that comprehensive sexuality education is gonna hamper what Panamanians believe by bringing in the gender ideology. And it is important, they believe, that people know their emotions, mainly women know their emotions and bodies, so they're more conscientious of their behavior and their body. And in that way, they believe that unwanted teenage pregnancies can decrease. And they agree, like comprehensive-based actors, they agree parents must be involved. But in this case, they say that parents need to be active participants and or revise what their kids are taught in school. So another thing that we saw in these interviews is that they ask for people to self-regulate. So in Spanish, they call it autorregulación. So basically that people regulate their emotions and how they behave so they don't have sex. So basically what they were advocating. And then I did a brief document analysis of the 5 guidelines that are now in the law of sexuality education in Panama. And these guidelines trying to abide to the comprehensive sexuality education guidelines of UNESCO. So they do talk about mental well-being and self-esteem, but they also are very heteronormative and adult-centric. So basically, youth and children are not, I don't know how to say this, but like they are not mature enough to make decisions or to learn about sexuality. And sexuality is seen as something punitive and dangerous. And they do have a pro-life speech of being life since conception. And there is a guideline directed for teenage mothers and pregnant adolescents. And through that guideline, there is a romanticization of motherhood. So, and a normalization of pregnancy, because in Panama, most of these pregnancies are product of rape. So yeah, I'm going very quickly to the survey. Thank you, Umi. So then I conducted a survey, it was a lot. A survey with 190 students from a college in Panama to us, and I did an experiment that they had to watch a video of an actor who my mom played, an actor supporting comprehensive sexuality education, and they responded questions about sexuality education, mainly supporting comprehensive sexuality education. Then an actor, again, my mom, saying that supporting abstinence-based programs, and then they responded questions. And then I wanted to see how it changed their opinion. So I asked them what they thought about it, their reception, and in blue, the comprehensive-based students, the exposed ones, actually agree with what they saw. Whereas in the abstinence, there was more polarization. Some of them agreed with the abstinence, but other ones were like, no, this is not okay, because I opened the question like, why do you say agree or disagree? And then I asked them if it changed their opinion. And as we see, I'm very sorry, very quickly. And then when I asked them if it changed their opinion, in the comprehensive base, we saw that it did change their opinion. And when I saw that it didn't change it, but when I asked them why it changed or not, they said, because I already knew about this, and I do agree that we have to teach this. So it was their opinion already. And when there was a polarization in the abstinence again, because when I asked them why it changed, some of them said like, it didn't change because I already knew this, that abstinence is the one that should be in Panama. So it's very interesting. And the results were statistically significant. So there was a change in their opinion. And then I asked them if they learned something new, and the comprehensive-based people did learn something new, whereas the abstinence-based treatment didn't learn as much something new. And I also had a control group in this. After the video, some people didn't have a video, so that was the control group. And I asked them as well if they believe that young people should be taught sexuality education, mainly CSE. As we see in the control and comprehensive, everybody said yes. Young people should receive sex education, CSE, whereas in the abstinence, we had some people who say no. And I asked them why in the 3 groups. And the ones who said yes were like, because it's their human right. because it's a necessity, because in Panama we have a huge crisis. Whereas those who say no, they say because it's going to tamper with the morals of Panama and thinking narratives along those lines. And then we see again that in the supporting of the teaching of CSC in schools, in the comprehensive base, we see that yes, and in the abstinence base, we see mainly yes. But we do see, again, some people saying no. They don't, but it's a smaller minority. And I asked them again why, and the same line. It's a right, it is a necessity, and again, it is not part of our culture, it will make kids gay, and things like that. So in conclusion, this study revealed that a lot of people don't know exactly what is CSC, and for those who advocate for CSC need to find a way to get to the policymakers and to the people so it can actually be enacted. And if the research of this research evidences that narratives are important when examining each policy perception, implementation, and protection of people in Panama, because the way sexuality education is not being taught in Panama is quite dangerous, and it's affecting mostly people who are already marginalized. So yeah, thank you. Any questions? Sorry, I went over the time. I'm sorry. Yes.
The definition of offensive education, where is it based from? Like, you mentioned that there has to be a common understanding, and so I was wondering where should that come from? Like, is it a UN document? Is it does the state have to define how it will define?
Yeah, thank you. Awesome, very good question, and it's mainly the one from UNESCO. It's the one that is approved by UNESCO in their evidence-based comprehensive sexuality education, and yeah, the countries that said that, because some countries signed that they're going to implement that, Panama apparently, but they are not doing it. So they should follow that. Yes.
I was wondering if Panama has a kind of where they use this example, like talking about what is like practice, because like in many contexts they would say, oh yes, it should be like
it is not a country that should that is not look up, because the data we have available shows that daily 27 girls get pregnant, and it's actually a country that is used for yeah, see what happens when you don't have comprehensive sexuality education. Or
Panama uses other countries?
No.
As an example, like we want to be like.
No, they don't. Thank you, sorry. Okay. Anybody else? No? Okay, thank you. Sorry, I didn't understand that. Yeah.
I didn't.
Okay. Hi everyone. Good morning. Hola, gente de Argentina que está ahí. Okay. Bueno, thanks for listening. I know we've been, many of us, sharing our thesis. After this, we're going to have a mini break. My name is Marina. I am from Argentina, and I studied how data from large-scale learning assessments is used by governments, by politicians, to inform or not policy formulation processes, education policy formulation process. So before we start, let's unpack a little bit of what I studied. So the uses, my question was, to what extent was data used? Because internationally from the 90s and from the 2000s after PISA, many countries have been pushed to adopt large-scale learning assessment reforms, international large-scale assessment reforms, and national large-scale assessments to have information about the quality of education in their systems, right? The question was to what extent is all this data that is being produced, is it used, and how, and for what purposes? Now, what kind of large-scale assessment data? I included local, national, and international large-scale assessments. And from those, it was not only learning outcomes, but also data from context questionnaires. And about education policy formulation, well, the literature said that while there is a lot of data being produced and it is used for policymaking, it usually serves other stages of the policymaking cycle, agenda setting, monitoring, or evaluating policies, whereas it is less used for formulating policies, for policy design. And what kind of education policies? I couldn't study them all, so I used only pedagogic policies, which I defined as aimed at directly teaching or learning. This is curriculum reforms, teaching training programs. So to what extent were those initiatives shaped by data or evidence from large-scale assessments? And where did I study this? It was in Argentina, but because we are a decentralized federal country with an education system that has different levels of management, I decided to conduct a vertical case study. And instead of comparing Argentina as a country at the national level with other countries, I compared how these processes happened at the national level and in the city of Buenos Aires at the subnational level. Why this city? Well, because it was a pioneer in assessments. Actually, the city of Buenos Aires had an assessment before the national level, which was kind of something that happened in very few cases in the region. This is one of them. And from 2015, I studied the period from 2015 to 2019, before the pandemic. At the national level, there was a re-adoption of the national large-scale assessment that had been paused for 3 years. So with this re-emergence of assessments and that they were very important in the policy agenda, I wanted to see, okay, to what extent they translated or there were any uptakes of the data that they produced. So my first question was to what extent, and I analyzed policy documents, but also I interviewed politicians and policymakers. So to what extent was data used? Sometimes the documents said that data had been used, whereas in the interviews, they did not confirm this, or the other way around. In the interviews, they would be, of course, we used all this data, but then the policy documents did not mention any thing. And these inconsistencies were also important to me. And then the second research question was, how was it used and for what purposes? So I used this theoretical framework that categorizes types of uses, instrumental uses, conceptual uses to rethink a policy, to rethink a solution, symbolic uses, and non-uses. And where regarding the rationales, we've got political reasons or drivers for using data, social-cultural, which were mostly responding to international demands or values like evidence-based policymaking or a more scientific way of designing policies, technical rationals, or economic. This is quickly the research design. It was very interesting for me to learn about the way of comparing that is not horizontal, which is national level against another national level, but you have the vertical axis. I mean, I compared the national with the subnational, but you also have to bear in mind that these things are also happening in distinct locations, which have to be considered, and also historically. So why did we come up to this point in which we are using data in a certain way or we are not? These are my data collection methods, the document analysis, elite and expert interviews. I interviewed from the government actors with political profiles, with more technical profiles. These helped me to contrast like people who actually analyze the data and provide it to politicians, how they would have certain views of the uses that were made, and whereas the politicians wouldn't, and other non-governmental actors or from international organizations to contrast or to triangulate the information. Okay, so was data used? And this was surprising because I had assumptions, previous assumptions that were leading me to think that data was not used, that it was there, but it was not used. And to my surprise, it was used. Actually, it was used a lot and in very different ways. Mostly data from the national large-scale assessment was used at the national level, and from the local large-scale assessment at the local level, subnational level. But data from international organizations or regional assessments was less used. So this is something interesting because it's very expensive for countries to embark on this kind of policies. So it's interesting that this kind of data was not used, and this is also in line with the literature that says that maybe the rationales for participating in these international assessments is not does not have to do with a cost benefit, something that a cost benefit analysis would show, but there are other rationales. And then how was it used? So the 4 types of uses that I showed, instrumental, symbolic, conceptual, and non-uses, were used equally, interestingly. At the national level, mostly instrumental uses to target policies to certain actors, to reform the curriculum in mathematics, and to choose where to strengthen certain teaching policies, training policies. And in the city of Buenos Aires, interestingly, non-uses were mostly showed. And it wasn't that, I mean, politicians were purposefully not using the data. They clearly stated, we know that we have all this data, we choose not to use it to design our policies because we know our education system. We choose to, I don't know, design universal policies, so not targeted policies to specific schools or actors. So data for us is not important. It's more of an ideological, a political decision, so to not use data. So the purposes were mostly political. At the national level, there was an attempt of differentiate from the previous administration or the opposite political party. Whereas at the subnational level, differentiation worked differently, and now you'll see why. Vertically, the city of Buenos Aires was trying to decouple from the national level. So when the national level was advocating for data use, they were using data a lot, they had all this evidence-based for policy-making speech. The city of Buenos Aires wanted to decouple and become like a different case. And they were like, we know that there's all this data, we choose not to use it. So it was a political purpose or driver. Horizontally, the city of Buenos Aires has been trying historically, and now this study showed that it's still trying to singularize from other provinces. So it's the only city participating in international large-scale assessments as their own education system. It's also the pioneer province in innovating and assessing in different ways. So their symbolic uses of data or non-uses of data also responded to these attempts to differentiate and become singular in a horizontal landscape. And then transversally, which is the historical tracing, the rationales for adopting these policies, which were political, were also, there was a correlation of the political rationales as well for the uses. So this means that adopting an assessment, if it is for political reasons, then the political uses of that data are also related to that, which was something that, of course, now we can think that it's kind of obvious, but I wouldn't know at first. And some further research and directions. The only thing that I would want to highlight is that when we study policy making and decision making and politicians, it's important, or at least that's what my thesis showed, to not think of actors as rational actors. Like, because I have the data, this is very convenient for me, and this cost benefit analysis would mean or result in me using this data. So trying to approach this phenomenon from a non-rationalistic perspective, like there are other international drivers, there are cultural, political, economic drivers for actors to make those decisions, is very important. So that is for further research on these topics. And thank you very much. Yes. If there are any questions or comments, I would be very gladly, I would very gladly answer them. And if there are, okay.
I was wondering, did Buenos Aires or the local level, politically, you said they didn't want to use the data of the national level, right?
Yes, and also from their own data.
And why?
That's the thing. They, in the decentralized federal system, the provinces are in charge of managing their own. They have schools in charge. So they design and formulate policies that are affecting schools directly. Whereas the national level, they can't. They, very few policies can actually penetrate the school level before they design policies that are for the provinces, right? So this was one factor. The city of Buenos Aires and the policymakers there were, because they've been in charge, the same political party for the past 13 years, and because they work very closely with schools, one reason for not using the data was because they knew their education system. They don't need standardized tests telling them that mathematics is a problem, there's a problem with learning in mathematics. So this would, for instance, lead to, I don't know, a teacher training policy that was the same at the national level and at the local level, one being targeted to the lowest performers, to the lowest performing schools, to the poorer schools, whereas in the city of Buenos Aires, they would be like, no, we know our education system. We know that there's a lot of teacher rotation, for instance. So if we train certain schools or certain targeted teachers, the next month we will have them somewhere else. So because we know this and we know our actors, we know our system and the rules that operate there, it makes no sense for us to use that data to select certain actors, for instance. We'd rather do a universal policy. There are other examples, but that is one. See.
No, but like, I really wonder if you think how do they know? You know, do they gather data, or like, you know, as me person, like tomorrow I go to the study somewhere else. I don't know. So how do they add information, or do they learn, and how confident that they know?
That's an interesting question. On the one hand, I believe that there are certain profiles that were stable, relatively stable. But it is interesting because most of the politicians just in the city of Buenos Aires, they had already been working in the ministry before. So it's either they collected other sources of data and they used that to justify why they didn't use learning outcomes, for instance, or other data from assessments, or they were basing their assumptions on their previous experience. This also happened, for instance, with a policy where they wanted to it's extended schooling. It's a policy that maybe other countries or regions have it. And they were like, we know that more schooling time does not result in better outcomes. And that's what, and we are not questioning that. We are adopting that policy. What we ideologically stand for is that we want to offer a different kind of school experience in those extra hours. So to design which kind of teaching students had in those extra hours, they based on their own ideological standpoint. it has to be different from the traditional school. But there was no data operating in between, and they were very honest with this.
As well, like a lot of Swiss bar become like.
I think so. I think so. Yes, but I also think it's very important for people, for policymakers and these actors to be honest, and these data uses to be transparent to the public. Like, are there pedagogical aspects operating? Are there ideological or international influences operating? This honesty and this transparency, I think it would result in a better governance of data use and evidence use in policymaking.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, easy, and then we can have a break, everyone. No. Exactly. I believe that sometimes these decisions of participating in international large-scale assessments are made by certain politicians that are in the administration at that time, and then because it's you, for instance, you join PISA for the next 2 editions or 3 years. So maybe politicians change in that time, but someone made the decision, someone started to pay, and then you just have to participate in PISA. So I would have some people saying, it is what it is. We got to the government, and this decision was already made by an actor who was in charge of the assessment policy at that time, who's now the director of UIS Institute of Statistics in UNESCO. So it's a person that was very concerned with being part of the international discussion on data production. Whereas some other people are very certain that participating itself just differentiates the city from the national level, which at some point dropped its participation, and from other provinces, and even from other education systems worldwide. There are international assessments in which only Buenos Aires and Chile participate. And Chile has a long history of neoliberal assessment policies. So that is already sending a message. So the material, but also the symbolic aspects of participating and using or not using data were very important to this research. Bueno, thank you. Thanks, everyone there. We'll have a break for how long? 10 minutes. Dale, 10 minutes. We'll be back in 10 minutes.
Hello, Asif. Are you there? Okay. Open your camera.
No.
We want to see your face, Asif. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Seydar. I'm from Azerbaijan. My research is about institutional autonomy in higher education institutions of Azerbaijan, mainly from the perspective of policymakers, and how this policy arrived in Azerbaijan based on the this modernization process of education and institution, like neoliberal reforms or competitiveness reforms, you can say. My research problem, as many other post-Soviet countries, Azerbaijan is also trying to modernize its education after getting out Soviet Union, and it was basically on the they adopted many documents using the terms like 21st century skills, international standards, best practices, but most of these words are considered as empty vessels, as Steiner concept puts, which means they fill these words with local meanings based on their political agendas. And this comes in handy when they want to push some projects or policies. Yeah. And this process mainly intensified after the 2005 joining the Bologna process. Almost all of the Soviet countries joined the Bologna process in 2005, and they intensified their programs. Like when I was doing my literature review, I just saw that Kazakhstan's policies are following, Azerbaijan's policies following Kazakhstan's policies. Mainly, let's say, they created a special university with a lot of autonomy, and then you see that Azerbaijan does that. And then you see it in Georgia or in other countries. So there is a pattern following the European education, but Europeanization, but it's not always. The state doesn't know what to borrow from European education system. So that's why my research wants to explore how policymakers makes sense of institutional autonomy in Azerbaijan and identify the main factors affecting dissemination of institutional autonomy, and finally to explore the scope of autonomy of higher education institutions. So I asked how and why has institutional autonomy developed in Azerbaijan education system over recent years, and what were the drivers behind this choosing this institutional autonomy, because institutional autonomy is against the long history of Azerbaijan and other post-Soviet countries. They were planned economy, and basically, well, from my point of view, it was working. During the Soviet times, those guys won over USA on the space race. So what went wrong? We don't know. And everyone, what does institutional autonomy mean for Azerbaijan policymakers? Okay, they write it in the documents, but do they understand it? Or maybe they understand it, but the guys who are on top, in the ministries, not ministry, but in the parliament, those guys are the main ones that adopted these policies. And I'll come to that in my research too. I used Phillips' theoretical framework, it's 4 stages of policy borrowing. The first stage is cross-national attraction. So in order to borrow the policy, you have to be attracted to that. And there are a lot of different reasons. Maybe state wants to have a political change, or there is a dissatisfaction in the state, and etc. For example, maybe there is a PISA test scores which are bad, and they want to adopt new things in order to improve that scores. And then comes the decision stage, but decision stage are divided into 4 stages. Some of them are they reason their choices based on, let's say, they see that, okay, it works in Georgia, maybe it will work in us. Not maybe, but they say that for sure. My research from the quotes, I can, some of the policymakers say that, okay, because it worked there, it will work here. But it's not the case, as we know. and maybe sometimes they do the theoretical based, and sometimes the quick fixes, like they just need a to push a policy, and they need to show an example. Okay, this works in other countries, it will work in us, believe in us, vote for us, etc., etc. And then comes the implementation stage. And implementation stage, as we know, there are resistance in every country based for each policy. So, and there are different actors for that. In Azerbaijan, the main actor is the people who have the Soviet mindset, and other ones who are pushing it are new people who believe in new public management, neoliberal ideas. And the fourth stage I didn't use in my research because it doesn't cover, so I'll not talk about it. Methodology. I use official key documents such as this, like it comes from 1998 to 2022. As you see, there is a big gap between 2010 and 2021. It's because Azerbaijan adopted like some policy reform in 2009 and 2010. Then they just disappeared and they didn't do anything else about higher education until now. Like starting from last year, they had this Azerbaijan 2030 plan, which is like 4-page document for until 2030. Yeah. And then comes 2022. Last month, they adopted 6 decrees, giving 6 universities increased autonomy, not autonomy, but increased autonomy, I would say. And then there's a new law on higher education going on. It's not finished in 3 years. It's still going on, and it's in the parliament. I think those guys are reading it, but it's not known that when they will ratify that document. So, but that document is very important. I had access to this via the internship that I did in Education Assurance Agency, Quality Assurance Agency. So 7 people that I interviewed are from Forum Education Quality Assurance Agency, which is the main organization with accreditation and checking the universities. And then 1 person from the ministry who were involved in the writing of new higher education law. And then 2 persons from the Institute of Education of the Republic of Azerbaijan, which are under, this is an organization under the ministry looking at everything like research, projects, and etc. About education. And results and findings. I have 3 teams: Soviet legacy, internationalization, and decentralization. Soviet legacy, I divided it into 5 sub-themes: higher education, understanding top-down management, legislation, culture, and Bibles. So, yes, Bible. That's the interesting one. So in Azerbaijan, when I was interviewing a guy from the ministry, and he told me that there are certain Bibles in our like understanding that it cannot be changed and it cannot be offered change. So, and one of them is choosing the rectors in the universities. Like it should be appointed by the president himself, because it's just probably reasoning is that those people have a huge power, like they can affect people, like they can influence them. So they want to choose the people who can rely on. But he said that we are modernizing it. We give them like 5 years term. After 5 years, they can choose another one. And since I have 1 minute left, I'll just increase the speed. And then top-down management, like Soviet legacy has affected the management system in the higher education institutions. So that's why they are, it's an obscuring element in the internationalization process. It just prevents them to go on with the legislations, with the culture, and so on. And internationalization attempt is associated with the Europeanization attempt, which leads to the competition aspects, because they want to adopt this policy because they want to Europeanize and increase the competition ability of the universities and the students, because they say that, okay, there is globalization going on and my students are going to work or study in abroad. So that's why I have to have a education system that's compatible with European education. And that's why they're doing that. And fixes is here that like I want to check that if this internationalization process is based on the research or not, but it's not, obviously it's not based on research, but just the successful example in other countries. I mean, and then this is the target that they want to achieve, decentralization. State wants to share the responsibility with universities, and then they believe that it will increase the education quality, and also it will decrease the, let's say, the responsibilities of the ministry, so that they can just focus on bigger issues rather than telling the university, okay, you can have this 180 credits and this be divided into like 10 classes, courses, etc. Like fun fact, in Azerbaijan, like 240 credits is divided into 60 and 180. 60 is decided by, it's supposed to be decided by the university itself, and 180 is decided by the ministry right now. But when they want to give the institutional autonomy to universities come and say to the ministry that, okay, I cannot decide on 60 credits. How can I do that? Help me. So this is the situation. So they want to give them autonomy, but the capacity issues, ability issues are there. And then there's an accreditation system, like Azerbaijan should create an accreditation mechanism to support this autonomy, but this is lacking, and there is no quality assurance mechanisms. It's supposed to come with new accreditation law. It's still in the process, so we don't know when and what will change in this document, because a lot of people in the parliament will be against the autonomy process. And this is it. I could share more, but at that time, thank you. Any questions? Please. Yes, there are, please. Smolensk? Yeah, I know. I used to.
Public and private tertiary institutions. So I was wondering, are there any differences as well?
Like
A lot to like public.
Yes, regarding the, let's say that those private universities have this autonomy because they're not related, but still they have like financial autonomy is not there because state is mostly funding the universities in Azerbaijan, and it's based on the, again, planned economy. They have like this quota of having 50,000 students this year, and after 5 years it should be 120,000. And I think they can do that. They can do that by the decreasing the level of the the points needed for the acceptance into university, and this is via the state examination center. And most of the policymakers believe that this is an outdated system. It should be there should be a different system because it doesn't work. And yeah, regarding financial autonomy, they don't have. They have, but also they don't have. It's like complicated. But yeah, there is a difference. But still, management-wise, credits they decide on their own. But yeah, also, like, for example, they want to create a new program. There should be like authorization by the local authorities. So I wouldn't call that autonomy. So yeah, there's not much difference there.
So then one of the big problems that appear is like the lack of political will. It's the case in many of the presentations that we now heard. So in such countries, the keys to the post as of now, in terms of like contemporary geopolitics, do you think that there is any kind of international pressure or any influence by international organizations that are such to change these things?
Maybe 5 or 10 years ago, yes, but right now I don't think that there is much pressure on them, because like this will be very political. Like it's a few years ago, Azerbaijan changed its course on like being accepting European values. It says that we don't have to accept them. Like president says that. So after he said that, I can see that all of the organizations also stopped accepting or adopting European policies. Right now, they want to have just international, like they don't say European, but they say international standards. So it's a bit difficult. Yeah, yeah. But well, when I interviewed one guy and he said that we do not borrow policy from a particular country. We just look at the overall patterns and then take one policy. But I don't think it's like that. So it's just European policies that we need to adopt. Yeah.
Okay, great. And now Zoom going. Okay.
Okay. Hi. Okay, so I did my thesis on teachers as well, as have a number of us done. But I chose a different angle for my study. Why isn't it moving? Why isn't it moving? Okay, so because it's not moving. Okay, there it is. So in this course, we've talked a lot about inclusive education. But a lot of the time, and even in the literature that I look at, a lot of the literature has focused on children in classrooms. So who are the children that are supposed to be in the classroom? What does inclusive education mean for schools? You know, what kind of accessibility measures should we have? How are we supposed to train teachers to be able to handle, you know, all types of students and to have all kinds of students in all classrooms. But rarely have we talked about also the kinds of teachers that are in the classroom. So in countries like the UK or the US, there's a lot of talk about like who are in our classrooms: Latinos, black teachers, white teachers. But in the Philippines, for example, you know, we're pretty homogenous, right? So when you say Filipino classrooms, it's Filipinos. There could be different, you could come from different ethnic backgrounds, but generally you're not going to see other races in public schools, at least. Obviously there are international schools, but you know, that's very limited. And so my kind of inspiration for this was also because of the work that I used to do back home when I was doing policy work with teachers. And we were running a scholarship program, and we were a huge chunk, and the funding was from Australia, and a huge chunk of the funding was to be able to communicate that we wanted all kinds of people to apply to teach. So we wanted, including persons with disabilities. But when we were evaluating the program, we had found out that a lot of our teachers who were disabled were actually not able to get a job in the public school because the policies, not the policies, the actual application process was friendly to them. And that's why I kind of wanted to look more into that. But I didn't just want to focus on them becoming teachers or the application process, but like generally speaking, kind of how they grew up and what their experiences are. So this study is mainly exploratory. My main question really was what the experiences of disabled teachers are. And then in order to kind of be more specific about it, I wrote 3 more kind of sub-questions. So basically my study is a narrative inquiry looking at how these teachers grew up and how these experiences growing up influence their lives, especially like how it influenced their decision to become teachers and kind of the decisions that they make now as teachers. Because a lot of them are also teaching learners with special needs. So the framework I used was the social relational model, mainly because of the 2 structures that it provided. Sorry, the 2 dimensions that it provided. The first one was structural, which is a lot of what we've talked about in our classes. These are the more physical ones. So, accessibility, discrimination, policies. But there's also, and this is why I like the SRM, this model specifically, because of the focus that it also gives on psycho-emotional dimension. So meaning how these kind of discriminatory policies, how these inaccessible policies or buildings, etc., actually affect the individuals, the disabled individuals internally, and kind of how they see themselves, how they see their disability. Yeah, so I use qualitative inquiry. I did all in-depth interviews because I wanted to hear their stories. So it was not, they were semi-structured interviews, basically allowing my participants to kind of share their stories from childhood up to the present. So for this study, I chose public school teachers from the Greater Manila area, which is actually where, because it's the kind of biggest area, it has the most number of teachers. All of my teachers were female. And then I focused also only on physical impairment, because there's a whole other dimension if I went through like kind of hidden disabilities, like learning disabilities, etc. And then obviously like all of them were interviewed online because I couldn't go home, and even if I did, I wouldn't have been able to meet them in person anyway. So what did I find out? So in terms of structural barriers, these are the pretty obvious ones, like I said, and I'm sure like regardless of whether they were teachers or not, these are some things that we see a lot happening to persons with disabilities. So inaccessibility of buildings. So especially like in the Philippines, public transportation is not very friendly for PWDs. Not all buses have ramps in them. Not all like train stations or subway stations have elevators. And then of course there are the negative attitudes. There is a kind of stereotype of persons with disabilities in the Philippines where they're limited to stay at home. They provide entertainment, like they're the joke of society. And yeah, basically because they are physically impaired, the thought is that they can't really do anything. And then of course unfriendly workplace practices. So there's actually a lot in common with what my participant said with the results of Umi and her study about the workload and salary and things like that. So these are all things that a lot of teachers kind of go through and worry about around the world. There are also power relations present. So between teachers, so all of the teachers that I interviewed came from lower socioeconomic classes. And almost all of them had more than one sibling. There was one interviewee who had, I think they were 12 children, the family. So obviously there were decisions that needed to be made by the families, by the parents, on who was going to be able to go to school, who are we going to fund to actually complete their schooling. So actually all of the teachers that I interviewed had to find their own way to fund themselves. Also because school funding in the Philippines. So we have public schools that are free, but sometimes in secondary school and obviously in university education, it gets more expensive. So if you didn't have the money, or if your parents didn't have the money, then it was really be difficult for you. And then, so to go into the psycho-emotional kind of aspect. So this is the term internalized oppression is one of the things that I saw from my readings. But they had different manifestations. So number one is being in denial. So four of my participants, 5 of them have visual impairments. But they happened gradually. For a very long time, they were in denial that they had a problem. Because they obviously wanted to be treated as normal. And because of that, or because of the prevalent attitudes of society, they constantly needed to prove themselves that, I am better than my disability. And then, of course, because of the issues that they encountered in school at the time that they were students, teachers really weren't trained yet on inclusive education and kind of handling different learners with different needs. And so when they were studying, school practices were not very friendly to them, and so they really couldn't participate as much as they wanted. So they felt they often alone, and sometimes even discriminated against. So this is a quote from one of my teachers. So all my interviews were a mix of Filipino and English, but I translated all the quotes in English. So she was talking about a neighbor who would talk to her mom, asking like why send her to school. And she failed her school exam because she wasn't given the opportunity to kind of have help for that. And this is one thing that was, I think, more important. They weren't simply like receivers of these like attitudes, right? So they kind of found their own ways to resist the system through positive relationships. The determination that they had were actually, in my opinion, like active decisions on their part to kind of not be undermined and not to be let down. And so at present in their classrooms, especially because they teach a large number of students as well. Yes, that's my time. Yeah. They kind of try to encourage their students to also kind of be a bit, to also fight for themselves. So obviously they fight for their students, but they also kind of teach their students to fight for themselves. So this is another quote. Again, like as I mentioned, because one of the things that they expect people with disabilities to do is just to stay at home. But one of my participants was very adamant, and she really felt she made her way through on her own. So in conclusion, so there are 3 that I was able to conclude. The first one is really like the effects that the attitudes of society had regarding disability, and of course their own socioeconomic status. The second one, up till now, that even though there are a lot of policies in place regarding inclusive education and not just inclusive education, but like the inclusion of people and of disabled people, there are still a lot of barriers to that. And then third, of course, is because of their own experiences, they know what it means to kind of be this kind of student, and they use that as a motivation for their students. So just to close, 2 potentials for this study. So even though my sample was small, it was 7 teachers, my hope is that it also opened up conversations regarding, how we can potentially further support learners with special needs, and at the same time, how schools can better facilitate and support the diversity of staff. So because it's not really something that we talk about, as I mentioned, it's mostly about students, but we don't talk about like who are in the schools who are actually teaching. So yeah, I think it's thank you. Are there questions? Yes, Renata. Yeah, so okay, so in the public school system, they are trying to have inclusive classrooms. So there are grade levels. I don't know if it's applied to all grade levels, but there are certain grade levels, I think mostly in the lower grades, where there are classrooms where there are inclusive classrooms. At the same time, there are still segregated classrooms. So in the structure of the public school system, you have segregated classrooms and then you have inclusive classrooms. And then sometimes the students, the disabled students or the learners with special needs who are in the inclusive classrooms still receive special tutorials from their teachers when they were still in the segregated rooms. Because a lot of the time, this is also a problem throughout all public schools in the Philippines. A lot of the time, a classroom would have approximately like 45 to 50 students, and you have 10 sections in one grade. So obviously there's more teachers teaching, but because you have 60 kids or 50 kids that you're minding, a lot of the time the teacher is not able to really take care of the learner with special needs. And so sometimes they still have their tutors from when they were still in segregated classrooms. But it's also like a very material problem because it also has to do with budget and lack of classrooms and lack of teachers. So there's a lot of factors to it. But yes, so they teach in the public schools, and they teach, most of them teach in the segregated classroom and tutor some students who are in the regular classroom. Anything else? Thank you.
¿Quiénes son así? No, estamos en tu. Pero ¿cómo hacemos? ¿Estás lista? No voy a estar más lista que nada. Ya tenemos presentación y avance nomás. ¿Sí? Ok. Gracias.
Hi, everyone. I am Ari, and I'm from Peru. So my research was, of course, in Peru. And I focused on WhatsApp and distance education. We all know, especially my cohort, I think, that the pandemic and everything that meant impacted our education. And so it happened to many children in primary and secondary schools. Right? So I thought it would be interesting to see how the distance education experience was lived by students from vulnerable backgrounds in Peru. Why students from vulnerable backgrounds? Because they are the ones that are really impacted the most when things happen, because, you know, life is unfair. And why students from secondary school with distance education? Because research normally focuses on on higher education students dealing with distance education. You know, because normally distance education is something that you choose, right? So I have the time and the technology to be able to do distance education, therefore I choose it. But now it was sort of imposed by the situation, so not necessarily everyone had the same elements to deal with distance education in the same way. Okay, so yeah, sorry, my slides are a bit in disorder. Well, this basically sums up why I chose the study, which I already explained. And this took me to the following research questions. The first one was to discover, and in this sense, as Sarina's study, this was exploratory because it had not been done before, because of course, this is the first time, hopefully the last pandemic, but not really, because, you know, things will happen again. So with my first question, I was looking to describe and explore how a WhatsApp classroom looks like from the perspective of the student, right? Because a lot of research is focused on teachers or systems, but not that much research is focused on students and how they live the education experience that policymakers and everyone and adults, you know, design for them. The first research question then helped me to answer the second one. So it's how the WhatsApp learning culture was expressed in the actions, emotions, and learning of public secondary school female students from rural backgrounds, and what does this learning culture allow or disallow. And in this sense, I used, well, my methodology was a single case study. I used a participatory approach, and I used emojis, an emoji elicitation technique for my focus groups, because I was talking about feelings with teenagers. That's hard normally. And also these teenagers come from rural backgrounds, so they are quite shy anyways. So a good way to, you know, ask them to talk about their feelings without asking them, how do you feel, was to make them choose emoticons. And then I would ask them, why did you choose that emoticon, right? So they would talk to me about their feelings without feeling, I don't know, harassed in a way. I did in-depth interviews as well, and I did my fieldwork in Peru, in these two places. So, well, Lima is there. I am from Lima. Cusco, everyone knows Machu Picchu, right? So Cusco is very near Machu Picchu. And I did it in those two cities, Ollantaytambo and Calca. There's maybe 1.5 hours away between both of them. The students that I chose were all female, all came from rural backgrounds, all identified as indigenous and spoke Quechua as well as Spanish. That already from the design positions them in a place of vulnerability, which for me was interesting also because I decided to focus on the type of technology that they had, right? Because I mean, the digital divide normally focuses on, do we have access or we don't have access? But it's not really a thing of having or not having access. It's more a thing of what kind of access do you have, right? Because distance education is one thing with Zoom and in a computer and with a stable internet connection. And it's a completely different thing when you do it from a phone, on a WhatsApp platform and using 3G or 4G. So besides the digital divide, the other theoretical framework I used was learning cultures. This is a very broad theoretical framework, which took me a while to understand. I'm going to be honest, I had trouble, but I got there in the end. So basically this comes from the broader epistemological framework that believes that learning is not only cognitive, right? So I have right. Learning is not only cognitive, it happens through other aspects of our social interaction. And learning cultures basically ask how particular practices will impact my learning opportunities. So what will particular practices allow or disallow? And they have 3 dimensions: time, scale, and action. Yeah. So what happens with everything that I have said until now? Basically, the socioeconomic and sociodemographic determinants, which I already explained, right? Rural background, female students, secondary school, and the type of technology will impact the action, right? The action of the student will then impact that learning culture of that space. And it's sort of a self-feeding loop, you know, that goes on and on. And what did I discover? I will not focus on, you know, the parts of the feelings and communication because that was a bit long, but I will focus on what the WhatsApp learning culture allowed and disallowed in this particular context, right? So it allowed for the retention of students that didn't have any other means of connecting, okay? Because they didn't have a computer, they could not access Zoom, so accessing education through WhatsApp was a good strategy for retention, you could say. It allowed for increased communication of students in the classroom because students felt safer. These female students from rural backgrounds felt safer. Why? Because in their normal, you know, school days, they suffer a lot of bullying and discrimination because they are from rural backgrounds, because they have an accent over Spanish, because many different things, right? So WhatsApp sort of equalized in a way that it also allowed a copy-paste praxis because of how the classroom was organized. There were so many questions that expected an answer immediately that students were just copying the question into Google and then pasting the answer back, right? And what did it disallow? The WhatsApp classroom disallowed interactionism in teaching, in the teaching of subjects. So significant learning was made very complicated, especially in subjects like maths. They didn't understand basically what they were being taught. There was no time and space to ask questions to the teacher because the teacher would log out from the WhatsApp group immediately. So, you know, in the classroom, they would wait for recess, go to ask him or her something. Now that space is gone, which at the same time also reinforces looking for answers on Google, right? Because I don't have my teacher, so I will Google that. By promoting copy-paste from Google, it disallowed retention of information and in-depth understanding of the subjects. And also it disallowed motivation in high-achieving students that said, okay, why am I going through all this hard work of, you know, reading my notes if I can copy-paste from Google and I will get the same grade, basically. So if we go back to what, because for me, the most interesting discovery in this research was communication. That they felt safer in this space to communicate and to express themselves, because, you know, that you could say it's equalizing, and you could argue for, you know, WhatsApp or those sort of media types of platforms that we allow for this communication. But at the same time, is that really equalization, or is that an invisibilization of an identity, right? So because in education, we don't only learn things to become qualified, we don't only learn how to socialize, but we also build our subjectivities. And if you are building your subjectivity from invisibility, because you feel comfortable in that invisibility, you know, then that could bring some troubles, not only to you as a student, but to society as a whole. Yeah. And well, this is a picture of what a WhatsApp classroom looked like. You see, well, the phones and everyone copying from the phone to their notebooks because that's what they were doing. And yeah, I think in very like summarized, this is my research. If you have any questions, thank you. Questions, no questions, no questions?
I have a question, but yeah, I wanted to share with you. How was an everyday class through WhatsApp?
An everyday class through WhatsApp in this context was as follows. The student would go on a WhatsApp group, and the teacher would ask a question. Are you present? And then the student had to, you know, like mimicking a normal classroom. Yes, I am present. And everyone would, you know, go say that. Then the teacher would ask a question about what they studied the day before. And the students were expected to answer, in the sense that if they didn't answer, they would not be considered present. So in that sense, it becomes very performative, right? It's, you know, I am present because I give you an answer. You don't really check my answer. That's why, you know, copy-paste from Google was very, very normal. After that, the teacher would send either audios or texts or pictures, you know, like a picture of a textbook, whatever, to the WhatsApp group with the new subject, the new theme for the day. And then another question about this new subject. And then at around 1 p.m., classes would finish, and then all afternoon they had homework. So a lot of these girls were telling me, you know, I don't go, like, we don't go to school anymore. We just do homework. No, so really the school experience, at least in WhatsApp, in a way becomes performative. And then what they actually end up doing is a ton of homework, which they either copy from Google or just share. Like, I don't know, one student would do math, the other would do Spanish, and then they would swap. So, you know, there was no real, well, I mean, there was learning, and this is the interesting thing, because this was not part of my research questions, but it came through during my fieldwork. And these girls told me, you know, that they were learning Korean. And I was like, why are you learning Korean? And they were learning Korean because they love BTS, which is a K-pop band, right? And so I was like, what? And I asked them, why do you like them so much? And they told me they like them because of their lyrics. And then I was like, how can you understand the lyrics? Because they are either in Korean or in English, and they only speak Spanish and Quechua, right? And then they would tell me, ay, señorita. And they would say, we just copy paste the lyrics on Google Translate, and then with videos in TikTok, we learn Korean. And I was so surprised, you know, because I mean, learning may be like formal learning or school content learning. Yeah, they were not learning that, but that doesn't mean they were not learning. You know, they were learning other things that maybe were more interesting for them, or things that they could engage with in a more dynamic way, because they were doing like videos with the BTS songs and pictures of their friends, you know, so they were not only consumers of that knowledge, but also producers of knowledge within that context. So that makes me think, you know, if we listen more to students, their experiences, perhaps we can harness better ways to teach, or ways that are closer to the student, at least. Yeah, you know, beyond the WhatsApp classroom in that way. So that was the most interesting thing of my research, but it was not part of my research. It was just like a serendipitous moment, like Aina would say, that happened through, you know, through the field work and being with the students. Yeah. So yeah, sorry, it was a lot. About? Ya sabía.
But are we sharing? Yeah, sharing. No, but this one, right? No. Oh, guys, this. Oh, perfect.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, I'm Isidora. I'm from Serbia, and as you can see, we're tracking pardon me. We're tracking neoliberalism today in Serbia. So why? Has it changed yet? Why is it important to research neoliberalism, especially within the Serbian education policy context? It's because neoliberalism is an ideology that's firmly embedded within education, and it's profoundly shaped and guided and transformed education policy, practice, and reform all over the world. And in fact, this impact of neoliberalism is proven to be quite destructive for education, and particularly as it pertains to education quality and equity, and also to the status of teachers, but this isn't usually considered in the top two. Yeah, neoliberalism, as I said, impacts education systems all over the world, but the adoption of the neoliberal agenda is really made quite clear in the post-socialist European space, because we can actually track it to its very beginning, right, in the 90s. And Serbia is one of those. It's a former socialist European country that began its transition into a market economy and the corresponding education reforms in the early 2000s. And this education reform has been characterized as definitely liberalizing. However, the current understanding is that it's a segmented reform, right? It's actually like a series of reforms due to the frequent changes in government and hence the directions of politics in the country. But maybe my research will prove it to be something different. Let's see. So how did I research this? I really wanted to understand like how neoliberalism is manifested within the education policy in the country, and also which neoliberal elements So principles, policies, mechanisms are present within it in this space. So from the first document, 2003 to today. And then also how the presence of these elements fluctuates during the period. So I conducted a content analysis, a quantitative one for strategic education policy documents. The first one is the Law on Education System Foundations, and it kind of covers the direction that education will take from 2003 to 2008. The next one does the same for 2009 to 2011. And then we have the Strategy for Education Development in Serbia, which does as the title says, for the period from 2012 to 2020. And then the last one, which covers actually 2021 and onwards up until 2030. So I've framed that as like present day, because we never know, we could get another one. And here's what we found. Basically, neoliberal elements are very present in education policy in Serbia, which is to be expected. And the reform, in fact, isn't segmented and non-cohesive. And in fact, I think we could kind of look at it as a singular reform that's very cohesive, and it's leading education in Serbia towards increasing neoliberalism gradually. So this reform, I think, we can quite clearly segment into two phases. One is the phase beginning in 2003 and ending in 2011. Which I've called the education market creation phase, because it kind of lays the groundwork for more neoliberalism to come. So can we, oh, sorry, we have a person in the waiting room. Can we admit them? Or, I don't know. Can I click that? Oh, perfect, I did it, it's fine. So it kind of lays the groundwork for further neoliberalism in the future. So what we have here are policies such as redefining the purpose of education in order to fit market interests and market needs. We also have basing education on neoliberal principles. So individualism, employability, competition, efficiency, innovation, entrepreneurship, and such. We also have ones that are very particular to the post-socialist space, which is liberalizing the textbook market and also introducing privatization in education for the first time. And then we also have the framing of learners as consumers for the first time, and also introducing increased monitoring and evaluation of the teaching and learning process, particularly of teachers, and low-stakes testing for the first time. So that's the first phase. The next one starts in 2012, and it's still going on. And it's the one that I like to call the embedded neoliberalism phase. In this one, we have the situation where we build upon what we previously had, and we introduce a series of new policies and mechanisms, some of them intensifying the previous ones, like now we're adding school ranking mechanisms, and we're judging teachers based on performance-based assessment and incentives, and we're introducing high-stakes testing for kids, and we're now saying that quality is only what we can measure and observe, and we're measuring teacher quality based on how they help kids perform better. And we're introducing accountability strategies. We're also intensifying privatization, and it's going from just we can have some private ownership and private funding to private actors are now involved in all aspects of education, and in fact, they get to shape education in order to fit the needs of business. And lastly, we have a series of funding mechanisms which go further than just introducing private funding, which also decrease the share of public funding as a total, as a share of total funding for education. So this is per capita funding, co-funding, fiscal decentralization, and commercialization of student loan schemes as a way to compensate for the lost public funding, right? So per capita funding basically means we're only funding schools based on the amount of students they have, which can be detrimental to rural areas, which also happen to be the ones with not a lot of children, and also happen to be the ones who are underdeveloped. So like, how are we going to compensate for that? Co-funding is in tertiary education, which used to be free for most students. Now it's no longer so, and students are going to be expected to co-fund a part of their education, their higher education, and then we're introducing student loans to help them. So yeah, two distinct phases, and very coincidentally, 2012 also happens to be the year Serbia was awarded official candidacy status for membership into the EU. This also makes more sense when we look at all of the documents and see that they very clearly and quite explicitly state that Serbia is intended on joining the European Union and also wants to, wherever possible and whenever possible, emulate EU policy and trends. So yeah, when looking at it all together, I think the main sort of insinuation I guess I could make out of this findings is that if everything continues as it's going now, we're going to be heading into the last kind of phase, which is the perpetual embedded neoliberalism phase, which is also the place where a lot of post-Soviet European countries are in now. So we're very much following that discourse, the post-socialist phase in Europe. Yeah, so I've identified, where do we go from there? I don't know, but I've identified two drivers of emancipation, so two possible drivers of change. This is teachers, of course. Their status and their professionalism are a site of struggle between the competing ideologies that we have in the education system. We have the socialist ideology of the past that's framing teachers as these competent, qualified professionals who are going to lead us onto educational and societal development. And then we also have this view of teachers as commercialized professionals, ones that we say are good or bad based on how they keep kids, how they get kids to have better achievement and so on. And it kind of boils down to what Ball calls the terror of performativity. And then secondly, we have the early childhood education and care sector, which continues to reject the neoliberal framing of quality and the narrowing of quality under neoliberalism, and then remains a space for actually exploring these meanings and values in education that are outside of the neoliberal discourse. So I feel like I've identified these two as kind of maybe not only ideologically something that's a basis for change, but also maybe resource centers and such for hopefully change in the future. So I guess I'm done. And before saying thank you, I did want to sort of say what the presentation template is based on. So we're in Barcelona, which I will, I think, forever hold as like my GLOBED place. I felt it was only right to connect my thesis to a true Barcelonian, Joan Miró. And this is his artwork. It's called A Woman Dreaming of Escape. It was done during Franco dictatorship. And I kind of want to relate it in saying that I'm also dreaming of education escaping the dominance of neoliberalism. So thank you. All right. Questions? Questions? No questions? Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
8 years long, because we are now in accepting like school teacher KPIs. Yeah, 8-9 years behind.
Hopefully you won't meet us here. Yeah. But no, I feel like that's yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. A few years before.
Yeah.
Not again. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think just to like wrap up based on your guys' comments, I think it's quite indicative that this adoption of the neoliberal agenda is deemed by Silova and Steiner-Kamsky, which we all know, as the like post-socialist neoliberal package, because it's what we all adopt, and it's something that maybe Lithuania will show us how to get out of, and then we can all follow in like 7 to 15 years. Let's see. All right, thank you. Bye.
No. Here is better. All right, great, perfect. My name is Dorothy. I'm from the US, and I studied basically youth social norms online and also the community's preparedness to protect them from online sexual exploitation. It's a very cute presentation. The topic is not so very cute. I'm very sorry. Okay, so setting up the background. Here are some terms you need to know. We have OSEC, I'll be calling it. It's the online sexual exploitation and abuse of children. And then you have CSAM, child sexual abuse materials, and also maybe ICT, which is information communication technology. And so OSEC can be described as any way that ICT is used either to facilitate exploitation. So maybe an older perpetrator is contacting children on social media and then asking them to send either materials or asking to meet up with them online. Or when the parents or family members of children use ICT to exploit their children and then send that content to buyers who are usually abroad. So here is a chart of the amount of reports for child sexual abuse materials, specifically just from the Philippines. And you'll note that from the pandemic, it skyrocketed and basically tripled in the amount of numbers. Globally, the numbers doubled, and then in the Philippines, they tripled. And so, you know, this is clearly a huge issue that is just really pushed by the pandemic and being in lockdown situations. So the victims and the perpetrators were online more constantly and at home with nothing else to do. A lot of people lost their forms of income, so they might have turned to OSEC as a way to kind of get some money and as like a survival method. Here's some quick facts. The child victims are getting younger. So the average age has dropped from 15 years old to 11 years old in the past 6 years. A lot of the younger victims, this was facilitated by an older sibling or someone in the family. 41% the abuse is by their parents and 42% by other relatives. And this is Philippines specific. 92% of all the reports globally come from reports from Meta-based services. So Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. Most of it is coming from there. However, these services, they know how to report it and they know how to take it down, but they aren't very helpful when it comes to stopping people from contacting children or stopping people from sending these messages. And then the other issue is that Meta is preparing to encrypt all across all of its services. So encrypting all the photos and messages off of Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, all of that stuff, which means that it'll be so much harder for people to report and track where these images and videos are coming from. The last one is that self-generated CSAM is increasing dramatically. So 374% more. So that young children are taking pictures of themselves and sending that content to somebody else. So I did my research in the city of Sorsogon in the Philippines. It is in the Bicol region, in that green little area over there, zoomed in, and then in this city location. Okay. I chose this mostly because of familiarity. I am I lived there, and so I have more contacts there. But also, I noticed that there is a lot of research on OSEC in the Philippines because it's #1 in the world for this type of crime. However, all of the research often takes place in larger cities. So Manila, Cebu, all of those data comes from the big cities where OSEC is known to be a problem and where there's a lot of cases. However, I wanted to see about social norms and how people felt about the issue in a location where it wasn't quite so common. So that was another reason why I chose this. So here are some pictures. It's a very beautiful place. There's surfing, and then this is the city area. So a lot of my research was in Sorsogon City. The theories I based my research off of. Okay, yes. Are theories that relate to the social norms and social actions. So basically, our behaviors are influenced by the behavior of our peers. And one example comes from a study in which people were looking at students' drinking habits of drinking alcohol. And when students thought like their peers drank an excessive amount of alcohol, they were like, oh, what I'm doing is not so bad. So this type of behavior can apply to a lot of different issues. And the way that you help change behavior is by explaining like the actual reality of the situation versus their perceived norms. In relation to that, I was looking at their risk perception and their risk preparedness. So do they believe that children are at risk for this? And if there is a case, are they prepared to handle it, essentially? So I had two goals. I was looking at what youth were doing online, and then I was also looking at how prepared the community was to handle these cases. I did a survey among the national high school students. This is the high school that is central to Sorsogon City, and it has 10,000 students. And so I received about 400 plus responses. I did 2 focus groups, and I did interviews with key actors in the community, teachers, principal, police chief, and the Department of Social Welfare and Development, DSWD. So these are the survey respondents. The ages were pretty, I guess, like diverse. Had students ages 11 to 17. I took out all of the responses from 18 and above. And gender, purple is female and blue is male, and then green would be those who chose not to respond or non-binary. So I gave that option. Here are some examples of the focus group data that I had. Some pictures. And just quickly running through, this is their internet use. So a lot of students use internet coming from broadband, and most of them use smartphones, and a lot of it is paid for by parents. And this is a little bit different from a previous survey that was taken 7 years ago in 2015, where only 4 out of 10 connected through Wi-Fi at home. So you can see that a lot more students have internet connection at home, possibly because as a result of the pandemic and needing internet for online schooling or for parents to work from home, but no. Facebook Messenger is the most common, 100% of people use it. And I learned that while, Peru had WhatsApp as their schooling method, Facebook Messenger was the schooling method of choice in the Philippines. So teachers would have a Facebook Messenger group with all of their students, and then they would chat there. They would send in their assignments that way. Teachers would make announcements on Facebook, like that. Friending people online. Kids are very comfortable friending people online. Half of them don't know all of their friends in real life, and 67% of them said that they have become good friends with someone they met online. Again, 50% of them have met an online friend, then in person, with the majority of them, like 90+%, saying that they met them to become friends. This is again increased from previously when 8 out of 10 did not add online strangers. So you can see like it's more than doubled. People are very comfortable now adding online strangers as friends. They are very confident also that the friends that they make online are real people. So they're like, I can tell if the Facebook account is fake. I can tell if it's real. And I've never been catfished. I've never become friends with someone who has a fake profile. Their privacy settings have done a lot better. Most of them do have settings that are just for their friends and are not public, which has improved from the past. They also don't post personal information. They don't post location tags. And yeah, this was a little bit more alarming. 84% of children have seen inappropriate content just on the internet, not seeking it out, but without wanting to find it. A good amount of them have also been sent inappropriate content, and about a quarter of them have known somebody who sent. And this has increased from the past. Key findings: students use Facebook for distance learning. Parents do not observe what kids do online. Making friends online is very normal. They think these are the online dangers, but OSEC is not something that anyone considers. And in the city, there's only 10 cases in the past, however many years, 5 years. So it's not very common. And so everybody says it's not common. Everybody doesn't think it's a thing. They think it's more of a big city thing. So there's a lack of information. There's lack of capacity to handle these cases if they did have it. But they do have training. Yeah, I think that's about it. Question?
Advertising, I guess the government would pay like with this, because at least in the past, as what conspiracy,
Yeah.
like it got money from allegedly from Facebook for like, sort of election campaign. That's the case of Philippines. So like just trying to understand how
there was a really great law that almost that passed the House and the Senate, but the last president didn't sign it before he entered the office, so it's just sitting there. But there was a really great law that was put in, like, had really great like policies that also held these types of companies accountable, that ensured that they like had to make reports and work together with government organizations and non-government organizations. It like the list of all these things, but it never fully passed. And I'm like, so close. So yes, things are being done. I think it is very alarming. And when they were writing these laws, a lot of the senators cited these huge increases as like a driving reason for why they needed to push for these laws.
Yes, and from the attorneys that there is a principle like when there's a case at school or when they know about this, what's the procedure, what do they do, what do they do, what times do they do, how does it work?
Well, basically the teachers report it then to the police. Everyone reports it to the police, and the police have these set steps where they have to first collect evidence, and if they have enough evidence, then they can go arrest the perpetrator or whatnot. But what often happens is that there's not enough evidence, and the office in the city doesn't really have the technological capabilities to handle difficult tech cases. So then that case has to get sent to a different province up north, a regional office, and then that office will then have to help with the whole thing. So they don't really have full capacity, like capabilities in the Sagan office, but if they are able to get enough evidence, then they do.
And a quick follow-up question, like, is there any action or program or policy
that exists? Not really. Currently, not really. And what is even more, I think, concerning is that there is no specific crime that people can be charged with in relation to this. So police have to charge them with things like child pornography or something rather than an OSEC specific one, but that new law would make it a crime.
Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and the recording will be published online as well. Goodbye.